the end of the day, Luckin is pointing to have the sales leverage come through the door, minimize the cost of the real estate by having as many transactions as possible, and so be it.
Imagine a morning in America. The familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee, a line at the counter, a warm cup with a green mermaid in your hand, a symbol of stability, everyday life, something that will never disappear. But now everything is changing. Across the country, those very green signs are beginning to fade, stores are closing, employees are losing their jobs, and a company that has been an integral part of American culture for decades is suddenly on the brink.
The brand gets recognized on a national basis, even though at the beginning this means that I might need to be suffering from some smaller losses on a per store basis.
What happened to the giant that seemed capable of surviving any crisis? This story is not just about coffee. It is a story about how politics and economics can collide in such a way that the aroma of a morning latte turns into the bitterness of loss. Trade wars, which began as an attempt to protect American jobs, unexpectedly hit those who are America. The people who pour coffee, clean the halls, and open the doors at 6 a.m. so that the country can start its day. When Donald Trump's administration announced new tariffs, promising to bring manufacturing back home, no one thought that one of the first consequences would affect the morning cup of coffee. But that's exactly what happened. Tariffs on Brazilian and Colombian goods rose to 50% and sometimes 100%. For companies that were totally dependent on imports, it was a blow they couldn't recover from. Coffee, cups, equipment, packaging, everything got more expensive. Even giants like Starbucks started to drown in a sea of rising costs. Sales fell for 6 consecutive quarters. Hundreds of stores closed. Thousands of employees lost their shifts and jobs. Management reassured investors, talking about restructuring and a new growth strategy. But behind the fancy words lay a simple truth. The company was downsizing to survive. While America was trying to cope with the consequences of the tariff war, a new era was beginning on the other side of the world.
Here in the United States, the coffee culture is much more mature, and a new brand.
China was rapidly building its own coffee empire. Luckin Coffee, a chain that no one had heard of a few years ago, was opening thousands of new outlets. While American stores were turning off their lights, Chinese ones were turning them on. Where Starbucks was closing its doors, Luckin was opening them. The irony is that trade policies designed to protect against Chinese influence actually strengthened China. While American companies were struggling to survive under the weight of tariffs, Chinese brands took advantage of this weakness to fill the void. Starbucks has always been a symbol of the American dream, a brand that exported lifestyle, taste, and culture. Today, that symbol is turning into a warning. When the global economy collapses under the pressure of politics, it is not corporations that suffer, but people. Every closed store is not just a business. It is a part of the American landscape disappearing forever. So who now holds the coffee crown of the world? Why couldn't even the most recognizable U.S. brand withstand the political decisions made in Washington? And how did it happen that American coffee is being replaced by Chinese coffee? This story is not about coffee. It is a story about how one cup can show who rules the world today. America is waking up later and later.
Trying to approach the overseas expansion without necessarily having the same level of localized and...
The morning ritual that once began with the smell of fresh coffee and a visit to the nearest Starbucks is now increasingly being replaced by empty streets and closed for renovation signs, behind which lies not renovation, but the end of an entire era. Until recently, it seemed that this company was invulnerable. Its logo was not just a brand symbol, it became a cultural icon, like a flag, like Levi's jeans or Bob Dylan's music. But today the symbol is fading. The reason is not fashion, not competitors, but what in America is called a new type of economic policy. And what was supposed to strengthen the country is gradually destroying it from within. Starbucks' decline began imperceptibly, almost silently, like fatigue after a long day at work. The first signs appeared back when the White House introduced tariffs on foreign goods, promising a revival of American manufacturing. President Donald Trump assured at the time that the new measures would protect jobs and support local producers. But the economy does not like slogans. It lives by its own rules. When tariffs on Brazilian and Colombian coffee reached 50%.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Many experts already understood that this would be a blow to everyone involved in coffee, from importers to baristas. Starbucks, as a company whose model is based on global logistics, was the first to feel the impact. Coffee is not oil or steel. It cannot be produced at home. Coffee does not grow in the continental United States. Small farms in Hawaii and Puerto Rico are just a drop in the ocean of national demand, but tariff logic makes no distinctions. As a result, the cost of beans for Starbucks nearly doubled, and with it, everything else became more expensive. Delivery, packaging, even paper for receipts. Within the company, they began to cut costs on everything from new technologies to cleaning. Employees who just yesterday were enthusiastically putting on their aprons began to dread morning meetings. Each one could end with news of new layoffs. But the problem was not just tariffs. Rising prices hit consumers hard. America has been living with inflation for several years, and coffee is an emotional, almost ritualistic product.
That will benefit Canadian workers and their businesses. Nous sommes réunis ici à un moment à la fois crucial et rempli d'opportunités. Le monde est devenu plus dangereux et divisé.
When the price of a cup of cappuccino rose from $3 to $5, it became a symbol. Even coffee is no longer affordable. Sales began to fall. Starbucks recorded negative growth for 6 consecutive quarters, and attempts to retain customers with discounts only reduced profits. At the same time, rental costs and salaries were rising. In some states, the minimum wage increased by 20%. All this turned into a perfect storm. Amid the crisis, Starbucks management issued a series of press releases assuring investors that the company was undergoing a transformation and moving toward a sustainable future. But behind these phrases lay what was referred to behind the scenes as survival mode. Corporate sources spoke of frozen projects, canceled business trips, and even budget cuts for coffee for their own employees and offices.
L'ancien l'ordre mondial est revenu. Et même si le Canada a prospéré dans ce système, nous savons que la nostalgie n'est pas une stratégie. C'est pourquoi nous traçons une nouvelle voie à suivre pour notre pays.
In some regions, managers were instructed to combine several locations under one management to optimize management. In practice, this meant that one person had to do the work of 3. By last fall, flagship stores began to close, those spacious cafes in the centers of large cities where people came not just for coffee, but for the atmosphere. New York, Chicago, Seattle, the cities where the Starbucks story began, were now losing several locations a month. In their place, empty premises with faded traces of signs were opening. Videos appeared on social media. People filmed familiar baristas removing furniture and taking down posters. One user wrote under the footage, "It seems that America woke up without coffee." This comment garnered millions of views and became a metaphor for what was happening. Meanwhile, the White House continued to insist that the tariffs were working. Reports spoke of industrial recovery and growing national pride. But the streets painted a different picture. Closed cafes, laid off employees, suppliers losing orders, small companies that produce cups, lids, and syrups.
And Canada's been tough on the military because they have a very low military cost.
They don't allow our banks, and you know that Canada does not allow banks to go in.
All depended on the giant, which was now cutting costs. Economists noted that every closed Starbucks creates a domino effect. Supplies are reduced, transport companies' revenues fall, and local budget taxes decrease. Some analysts compare the current situation to the collapse of the Detroit auto industry in the last century. Back then, America also believed it could protect its own, failing to notice that the world was already living by global rules. Starbucks, which had become a symbol of globalization, now found itself caught in the trap of the opposite process, isolationism. Everything that made it successful, cheap supplies, open borders, free trade, turned out to be banned. While the company was trying to adapt, a different story was unfolding in China. Where American chains were losing ground, local brands were quickly filling the void. Luckin Coffee, founded just over 5 years ago, opened 1,000 new cafes a year. Its strategy was based on speed, mobile apps, and low prices. While Starbucks spent millions to retain old customers, Luckin attracted millions of new ones, not with promises, but with affordability.
Well, you know, when U.S. officials talk, we need to make sure that we listen.
The irony is that the Chinese chain's success was made possible in large part by the same tariffs that destroyed the American one. While the U.S. was fighting imports, China invested in its own supply chains, making production as local and independent as possible. The American press pretended that nothing extraordinary was happening. Financial analysts spoke of temporary turbulence, but Starbucks' internal reports painted a different picture. They referred to a critical decline in operational stability and increased price risks associated with tariffs. One of the confidential documents leaked to the press claimed that if shipping costs did not stabilize within 6 months, the company could lose up to a quarter of its retail network in North America. This prospect sounds like a disaster, but it is already being felt on the streets. Small towns where Starbucks was the only place to sit with a laptop and a cup of coffee are now empty. For many people, it's not just a business, but part of everyday life. Losing such a place is like closing a library or a school. Where life once bustled, there is now silence and dust.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
What began as a policy of restoring America has become a policy of destroying its own infrastructure. With each passing month, it becomes more obvious that attempting to build walls in a global world leads to isolation. Starbucks is only the first victim, but it is far from the last. The fall of this company is not just a story about coffee. It is a symbol of what happens when the economy becomes a weapon and slogans replace strategy. Today, looking at the empty premises with logos that until recently shone on every corner, many are asking themselves, maybe the problem is not coffee, not management, not fashion. Maybe it's because America itself has stopped believing in the model of the world it once created: open, interconnected, global. Because Starbucks was, in essence, a reflection of that model. And when it collapses, it's not just a business that collapses, but the very idea of American globalism. That is why the story of Starbucks is not just an episode in a trade war. It is a mirror of the era, showing how easily politics can turn against those it was supposed to protect. And if even a company that built an empire on coffee cannot withstand the pressure, who can? When people talk about the Starbucks crisis, they often mention tariffs, falling sales, and store closures. But behind these loud words lies a much more complex and profound story. It's not just about politics or economics, it's about the very structure of global business, its fragility and dependence on thousands of invisible connections. What seemed to be a solid and stable system turned out to be a chain where each link.
On November 4th, our government will table the first federal budget, our first federal budget. And that'll be our plan to protect our communities, our borders, our way of life. Our plan to build a stronger economy where everyone has a chance to get ahead. And our plan to empower Canadians with new opportunities, better careers, and a lower cost of living. Central to those missions
pulls the next one along. Starbucks became a symbol of this interdependence. And oddly enough, it was this very interdependence that ruined it. The chain, once proud of its global scale, fell victim to the very globalization on which it had built its success. Its logistics were a machine tuned to perfection. Coffee beans from Brazil and Colombia, paper cups from China, equipment from Italy, syrups from France, digital payment systems from India. Everything worked in perfect harmony until one detail failed. When tariffs rose and each of these links became several percent more expensive, the chain began to break. Costs did not just increase, they multiplied. Transport companies raised their delivery prices, suppliers began to demand prepayment, and banks tightened their lending conditions. Any slight fluctuation now affected every stage, from the plantation to the cash register. One of the company's internal reports, which was leaked to the press, stated outright that the cost of a single latte
really build on that relationship. And I think that's why the outcome this week was a positive one. Well, we know that no deal has been struck. We know that negotiations are going ahead in the right direction.
Had risen by 42% in a year and a half. These are not just numbers. This is tens of millions of dollars in additional expenses every month. Even for a corporation with a multi-billion-dollar turnover, this is a blow that cannot be ignored. In addition, the decline in Americans' purchasing power exacerbated the situation. People began to order less often, and some gave up their morning coffee to go habit altogether. All this created a spiral effect. The fewer customers there are, the higher the internal costs of servicing the network. To compensate for the losses, Starbucks began to reduce working hours, cut bonuses, and consolidate locations. In some cities, hybrid cafes appeared, where baristas served two neighboring areas at once, simply moving from one to the other through a shared warehouse. These measures were supposed to be effective, but in reality, they only undermined the brand's reputation.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
People came for stability and atmosphere, but were met with tired employees and empty halls. While corporate executives in Seattle assured investors that everything was under control, tension was growing within the company. Complaints about a silent crisis began to appear in informal employee chat rooms. Layoffs without announcements, cancellation of bonuses, cancellation of training for new employees. Several journalists claimed that in some regions, Starbucks had introduced a practice of silent layoffs, when employees were simply not assigned shifts until they resigned themselves. The company officially denied this, but the facts spoke for themselves. Management tried to save face. Financial reports were published in carefully worded language, where the words losses were replaced with cost optimization and store closures with strategic consolidation. It was like a language game designed to hide a simple reality. The business was shrinking. Behind the scenes, analysts were already saying that Starbucks was no longer a growth company, but a survival company. While marketing departments came up with new promotions and seasonal drinks to distract attention, financial services counted every delivery. Any disruption, even a week-long delay of a container at the port, threatened to disrupt the operations of hundreds of cafes. After the introduction of new tariffs, imported equipment began to be delivered with enormous delays of up to 3 months. Some managers complained that they could not replace broken coffee machines.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
And temporary spare parts were cannibalized from closed outlets. Photos of coffee machines assembled from different models appeared on internal forums, Frankenstein versions. As the baristas themselves joked, it was irony hiding panic. But perhaps the main rift was not in logistics, but between employees and management. When the company stopped communicating openly and began feeding employees boilerplate letters instead of honest explanations, trust disappeared. People who had been proud to work at Starbucks for decades began to leave. Stories appeared on social media from former baristas talking about reduced shifts.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Moral fatigue and the feeling that the company is no longer for people, but for reports. This was no longer just an economic crisis, it was an identity crisis. And yet Starbucks continued to pretend that the situation was under control. Official statements included phrases such as new direction, digital transformation, and focus on the future. But in reality, the company was trying to buy time. Wall Street saw everything without press releases, falling revenues, reduced investments, declining margins. Investors began to demand action. To calm the market, management announced a restructuring that included closing some offices and reducing administrative staff. However, internal documents showed that we were talking about hundreds of jobs, not dozens. It is telling that even within the head office, they began to cut corporate expenses. Business trips were replaced by online meetings, and some of the premises were leased to third-party companies. At one point, even the internal cafes for employees switched to limited mode of operation. Symbolically, the company that built an empire on coffee could no longer afford its own cup. But even these measures did not stop the decline. Financial reports for the next quarter showed that losses continued to grow.
I spoke to Governor Trudeau on numerous occasions, and we'll see what happens, but it just sets up so good for them. Look, the people would pay much less tax than they're paying right now. They'd have perfect military protection.
At meetings of top managers, alarm bells rang. If the trend continued, the company could lose a quarter of its capitalization in a year. To maintain confidence, Starbucks launched an active PR campaign promising a new era of sustainable development. Rumors leaked to the press about possible partnerships with American farmers. Allegedly, the company intended to purchase more local coffee. Economists understood that this was fiction. Domestic production volumes could not cover even 2% of the chain's needs. But in the media, this story sounded impressive. Meanwhile, independent analysts pointed to a more serious problem: the company's systemic vulnerability. When its model is based on global supplies and each shipment is subject to additional taxes and duties, no internal reforms can save it. Starbucks found itself caught between politics and economics. Changing its supply chains is expensive, but leaving everything as it is fatal. Some experts said outright that under the new tariffs,
those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States. and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
The company's business model was no longer viable. Investors understood this too. Starbucks shares began to fluctuate, analysts lowered their forecasts, and banks downgraded their credit ratings. All of this pushed management toward new, even more painful decisions. According to rumors, at the beginning of this year, the company considered temporarily suspending operations at some of its branches in Europe and Asia in order to reduce the burden on its main markets. If true, this would be the first time in decades that Starbucks has considered reducing its presence rather than expanding it.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
In this situation, the contrast between the company's external image and its internal reality is particularly striking. To customers, Starbucks still looked like a cozy place that smelled of cinnamon and fresh pastries. But behind the scenes, there was a real management crisis. Managers fought for every number in the reports, economists fought for every line in the budget, and baristas fought for every shift. Officially, it was all called temporary difficulties, but more and more employees realized that these difficulties were not temporary. This was the new reality. Starbucks became a living example of how an interdependent economy can become a trap if you interfere with it without understanding its mechanics.